Hey y'all, so I just wanted to kind of make an introductory video to this project thing I put together for class, or maybe the video itself is kind of the project as well. Um, but anyway, yeah, this is Ulysses, and I decided to dig into just anything in linguistics that was looking at autism, um, just because I was super curious to learn more about it and also just think about my own experiences as an autistic person. And languaging is hard, just even just like the normal kind. So um, it was super interesting to look through all of these, and yeah, I put them together into a big table here. I've got about uh, 78 pieces in this list. Most of them are journal articles, but I've got a couple of other things as well. I had more pieces than this in here, but I decided to kind of narrow it a bit. So I took out books that were kind of like about communication or like guidebooks on communicating that weren't really like academic-y, I guess, or stuff that was like just more like popular literature written for parents. I also took out like I initially had some older stuff from like late 1900s about autistic communication and linguistics because I thought like it might be helpful to like see some of these older ones that people are referencing a lot. But I also don't think I had enough time to really determine like what like those top pieces really were. And like the value in reading them is kind of just seeing like where did they go wrong. So I tried to kind of narrow things down a bit. I kind of one way I thought about this was I'm going to be teaching gender and the humanities next semester, and I think I'm going to focus it on either disability or neurodiversity. Um, but I was just kind of thinking which like what kind of text would I actually use as readings for class. So there's a couple of videos and TED Talks, blog posts, a podcast, but I a couple like popular nonfiction books, but I kind of kept out stuff that was like wouldn't really be helpful even just to look at in a class or anything. Um, yeah, I kind of just went through like the typical as far as finding these goes, just a whole bunch of typing in a bunch of different search terms in a bunch of different places. I also tried just like seeing what books came up if you looked up like autistic linguistics or language or communication when going on like Amazon, like what books we had at Milner Library here on campus. We do have like I think half of the ones I found, at least physical books wise at Milner, were just like for parents of autistic kids or like how to teach your autistic kid to speak the right way or whatever. So kind of annoying. But definitely not the only pieces out there that kind of have that vibe. Um, so to kind of show you more of this table itself, I also have these tagged by type. So like video, journal article, TED Talk, book, podcast, etc. So you can, if you go to this page itself, you can sort it by type. You can sort the citations by um, authors, and then I also have yeared separately. So if you want, you can kind of just do a tour of kind of a timeline and look at the older stuff versus the newer stuff. Off to the side, I also have the abstracts for all of these. Some of these, like the YouTube videos, didn't have abstracts, so I either pulled the description to the video or for blog posts, just the first couple paragraphs. There's like one or two where I just put NA because they were like an introduction to a journal issue and like it didn't make as much sense to just pull the first paragraph and there wasn't an abstract, but um yeah, those are all just kind of copy pasted in here to look at, which I dig just as a way to really quickly like see what all of these are about. So other way to do that would just be looking at all of these tags that I've been adding. And I think the process of adding these tags has been maybe like one of the biggest parts of this project for me, and just thinking about how to tag these. And I've kind of just been changing what the tags were titled, what ones I included, what ones I didn't, while I kept adding sources here. And it's interesting. Like I know some of them aren't even like complete because I would have to spend more time kind of looking into them, and reading them like more fully to see like whether they mention like all these different topics I mentioned in the tags. Um, but yeah, I thought I'd just talk through a couple of the tags and themes throughout these that I found interesting, and then share a couple of my favorites that I found while looking through these. So, yeah, one tag that comes up a ton is autistic children. It's definitely a pattern throughout autistic literature and media and resources as a whole to focus just on autistic children, rather than all autistic people, autistic adults. Stuff that looked specifically at autistic adults, I tagged just because like it was slightly more rare, so I wanted to be able to find those again. Um, I wasn't sure, like, as far as the field of linguistics goes, like it does make sense to look at children in the sense that, like, if you're talking about language development, then looking at children versus adults would definitely be a different kind of study, because you're looking at people who are still kind of learning language. Um, but yeah, it's also definitely a trend to just talk about autistic kids as if there's no autistic adults. So yeah, it's kind of an but also fair. A couple of the tags I included here were like uses the term high functioning, uses the term Asperger's, just because those terms like aren't used anymore, and aren't really considered like an acceptable way to divide people who are autistic. And yeah, I think some of these are kind of like using the term, but also using other terms. But I thought it was just interesting to note like which ones were doing that and kind of just doing that practice of separating autistic people into groups based on how well they think they function, which not super great. Um, as far as like this linguistics class that I did this for goes, I did think it was interesting that there's actually a surprising amount of literature on autism and bilingualism, so that's a tag as well. Um, a lot of it's like just people saying like, should my autistic kid grow up in a bilingual family? Will it just be confusing? And nope, you're good. Um, and a couple of these are also bi or multilingual autistic adults talking about language learning as autistic people, which was interesting. Um, but yeah, I tagged one of these and found one of these as race slash ethnicity because it talked explicitly about that in the abstract. But yeah, it was just the one. So I think that's definitely just a wide open gap as far as like this little subset of linguistics goes. Like I also tagged stuff that was looking at people who weren't speaking English or weren't like from the UK or the US because that was also just about half a dozen of these. Um, but that does feel really important. Like if we're going to be looking at how autistic people use language, like to not just look at people speaking English, because English has its own ways of doing things, but it's they all there's differences in other languages too, to put that mildly. Like English does its own thing a lot of the time, so yeah, it would be cool as well to see more stuff on um the autistic people who aren't speaking in English or who aren't bilingual, but just like speak other languages, I guess. Um, another tag that I put on here to draw attention to would be um, I've got one that's just called Rex, which would just be like the stuff I thought was kind of cool and I'd recommend people read, just because like it made interesting points or like it kind of stood out to me. Um, I also have one for disproving myths and assumptions, which I thought was also kind of a fun tag to be thinking about. Like, which of these are kind of like reiterating past knowledge, whether that's good or bad. And then which of these are kind of saying like, no, actually, that thing that we thought before actually isn't a thing, or something along those lines. So that's also maybe one of my favorite tags here. Just seeing the stuff that's kind of going against the grain, and arguing that past research on autistic language hasn't been like entirely great or like accurate. So yeah, plus like the drama of we're disproving things, I guess. Um, Another kind of difficulty or thing I was thinking about while tagging these was just terms, thinking about whether to tag these as like language development, language skills, communication, because a lot of these are using those terms to talk about autistic people and their use of language. Like and I kind of tried to just go with whatever terms they use the most, especially in the abstract in the title, as far as tagging these goes. So if they kind of placed an emphasis on communication skills or communication, I would tag it with that. If the whole emphasis was on like language skills, language development, getting better at language development was the tag I used. Um, but yeah, it did seem like there was a kind of a difference to note between stuff that was kind of wanting autistic people to develop language further into like what they saw as this more ideal way of communicating with people, versus people kind of just trying to note like what do autistic people sound like and kind of being less prescriptive about it, I guess. So I suppose, yeah, that was another thing to note. I tagged some of these as clinicians practices therapy because they were explicitly about like treating autistic patients or as a counselor or a doctor or clinician or whatever. So they kind of had that audience going on. I tagged a couple of these with autistic voices slash interviewees. I don't think I got all of them, but I just tagged the ones where I was like, oh, they actually asked autistic people open-ended questions versus a lot of these are just giving autistic kids tests to take and then like reporting on the results, but not really ever asking them more open-ended questions or interviewing them and not sharing quotes like that. So that's what that tag is for. But yeah, you can kind of see all my different tags if you just click in here as well. I have one tag that's just helpful for actual autistic people, which was I just used once. Like there was other stuff that might have that was like interesting for me as an autistic person, but there was one that I found where I was like, no, this is actually super helpful, and like this would help other autistic people as well in doing X. Um, but that was one of the ones actually that looked at um, augmentative and alternative communication, which I've been learning about in, I guess, just the last couple weeks. And it's been really cool because I haven't heard the term before. People abbreviate it as AAC, um, but kind of just kind of describe like all these different ways of communicating that aren't just like verbally speaking sentences like I am right now. Like you can include sign language, using like apps to speak for you, having little like cards that you write down stuff on that you can hold up, gesturing, anything like that. Charades, I guess. That would be kind of fun to do like a charades game, linguistics AAC thing. But it was really interesting to see stuff that was on autism and AIC, just because there wasn't a ton, and it's just interesting to yeah see people like embracing this idea that autistic people like don't necessarily have to like develop their language skills into like what other people see as like a properly developed person, but instead just communicating in other ways. So that was cool to see, and just I just want to read more about it now, because like even just as someone with social anxiety, like I spent till now just not really participating in class because like I felt unable to speak. And for forever, I was just trying to push myself to speak. And if I had just like realized that I could have just used like little note cards to hold up or an app to talk, like that would have changed everything in undergrad and also I guess my master's and maybe my PhD as well. So like yeah, I feel like there's such an emphasis on trying to get people to talk more in class that like I remember thinking like in back in middle school even maybe that like I wish that there was just like a chat function where I could just type my responses and then just talk a bunch in class. But like that wasn't really a thing. And then when COVID happened, I did like Zoom in that respect. Like I could just talk actually a bunch just in the comments. And it was also cool, like as an autistic person, in that like I didn't have to like stop and wait for when I was going to come into the conversation, which I always struggle with. Like, even when I do want to talk and feel like I can, I will just sit there for forever, like waiting for a moment to cut in and then not doing so. Um, so, like, just being able to type a comment in Zoom was super badass, and I kind of miss it. But yeah, so like in that sense, some of this stuff like was just helpful for me as an autistic person to better understand like how I communicate with people. And a lot of it is just like instead of trying to push yourself to do X that isn't natural for you, it's just other people should be kind of cooler about it, which yeah, surprise, I guess. One video that I found really helpful that I just rewatched was this one on a TED Talk from Madeline Narkinsky. And it's just 7 minutes, but it does such a good job of like talking about how autistic people communicate and like the differences between non-autistic people and autistic people, and arguing that people like should and can understand how autistic people communicate a little better. And yeah, they did so just really quickly and eloquently, and I I dug it. The other source that I found that I really liked was this website called Stimpunks, which I might have actually just found while looking um for some. I think I was looking for autism punk stuff at one point, and then I found this page that they had. They have a bunch of different pages on this website, but um, they have this page talking about the autistic language hypothesis, which I thought was really interesting. I don't know if there's any scholarship on it yet, or I haven't found any at least, but they note that it's not like something that's been researched yet, so it's just a hypothesis. But as an autistic person, it makes a lot of sense to me. Like and I like that it's from autistic people themselves, like that TED Talk was as well. And starting to feel like if you're going to look at autistic language practices, like in a linguistics class, like it might just be helpful to almost entirely read stuff from autistic people themselves, like who actually kind of get it in that sense and aren't just like interviewing 24 people. Like I can't really discount, I guess, people who are like doing research and doing a ton of reading and are super smart, etc. But also like just going to the people themselves is always going to be helpful and do things that not talking to them isn't going to do. But yeah, I thought it was just interesting to see like how they described um autistic like pragmatics and like understanding of language versus neurotypical or non-autistic people. So like autistic people seeing the line "how are you doing" as like something to really parse. So like we're gonna think like when do you like how are you doing like sorry like what do they mean by how, what do they mean by doing, like what's kind of going on here, really parsing like each individual word, whereas non-autistic people like they argue have more of a tendency to look at what isn't said, to look at like the sentence level like as more of a chunk, as more figurative, subjective. So like how are you doing and how are you doing from your boss versus your friend, you're going to answer in different ways. whereas autistic people might tend to just focus on those words themselves versus like who's saying them, the context in which um, they're saying it, etc. And I do feel like that's kind of true of me. Like one, every time someone asks me how I'm doing, I will just take like 10 seconds to wonder about it and then just be like, I don't know how to define myself in several words. Like I could maybe give you like on a scale of 1 to 10, but like what does it mean to be being or doing and how can I describe that? I have no idea other than frazzled, but that's just most of the time, I think. Um, so yeah, I think how are you doing is just an interesting one that would be cool to dig into more. And just because it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, because it's one of the lines that I guess other people have used most with me just because it's so common and like I'm still figuring out ways to answer it. And like it is something where like I do think about it and focus on it a lot. Like I don't know if non-autistic people would do as much just like thinking about how to answer the question, how are you doing? Like maybe that doesn't matter, but for me, I'm just very much like, how do I get myself across here? I haven't done it yet. And like, what words can I use to describe how I'm feeling? And also, how am I doing in that particular moment? I have no idea. And then, like, what is this question even supposed to do in the first place? Like, are they asking for like how I'm doing emotionally or life wise? Like, am I doing great? What if I'm like doing great, but like emotionally, I just feel kind of dead? Um, am I supposed to just say like that I'm feeling dead inside, or is that just a mood killer? It might depend on the person, but I've spent so much time thinking about it, and like I do every time someone asks it. So I thought it was just kind of funny that that was their example here too. And I haven't watched these videos yet, but they have a couple videos where they're talking about this hypothesis. So I'm going to dig into that more. And they also have a cool creator grant this foundation that I want to check out. So maybe that'll be my summer job. Fingers crossed. I think I don't know, as far as other stuff I noticed here goes, there's kind of a division you can do between articles that are looking at just like the sound of autistic voices versus the grammar that they're using, or like word choice versus narrative and how they order things. So I tagged some of these with they'll focus on pronoun usage or verb usage. Um, some of them look at like sign language used by autistic people. I tagged some of these with nonverbal and semi-verbal, looking at autistic people who don't speak or hardly ever speak. Um, yeah, a couple of these looked at gender, like or specifically at autistic girls or women, and like a lot of them note that like autism does present differently in girls and women, and we're still kind of figuring that out. And it's helpful to do that because we're diagnosed much less than autistic men and boys, which sucks. But yeah, I think that would be most of what I'd want to point out here. This was the article that I thought was just the most helpful for actual autistic people. It's one of the ones on AIC, but it's looking at an app that one of my friends actually just mentioned yesterday, who is also autistic. But it's one of those apps you can use to like talk to other people, but like by typing or clicking different words that they have available. Um, and yeah, I just thought the ideas going on here were cool because like it's looking at this app in light of the best practices for individuals who are autistic, such as like how like the app looks, the symbols it uses, inclusion. Like it's kind of getting more towards advocacy, I guess, and maybe less towards like actually looking at linguistics and more just like at a little bit of a different thing. But I thought it was cool. I was talking yesterday with a friend about AAC and the fact that like Proloco is one of these apps, but um almost like none of them are like super great actually. And it was frustrating to find that out because like the ones that have a ton of words that you can click on or type in and like cool word banks or that are like the most well organized or accessible are on like just heavy subscription services that like insurance doesn't cover or any medical stuff like that, even though it'd be really cool if it could for nonverbal people. Um, and there are like free versions and free trial versions that just have like less words that you can click on and use, but or they're just less helpful or less well organized. But it was frustrating because I was like, I just want to make my own app now where I just you click a button and that says the word aloud. Like, why does that have to be so expensive? And like even just the fact that it's subscription and not just a one-time price. And like this would have been so cool if, like, as an accommodation for social anxiety, I could have gotten like just access to an app like that to talk in class. Like, even aside from my being autistic, and like there isn't as much, I think, like acceptance yet. Like, I just joined a Discord server for people talking about AAC, and like even among the people who use it, I still saw just like looking through just my notifications, just a lot of people feeling trepidatious about using AAC because like they didn't really want to draw attention to themselves or like they thought other people might think it was weird. And we should just try to reduce that stigma more. Like I don't think I've seen like AAC ever mentioned in like syllabi or anything, but that'd be a cool thing to mention, I think, as teachers. Like as far as accessibility goes, um, like the possibility of using like apps or like writing on a whiteboard to talk or something like that. Like a lot of people don't like talking in class or aren't comfortable doing it or like are better or feel like it's easier or do find it easier or are better able to express themselves in writing, like even aside from autistic people or people with social anxiety. So like I just like I want it to be more of a thing and less of a stigma to use apps like this. I want it to just be acceptable that anyone like can use this if they don't feel like talking, that they can use an app or a whiteboard or whatever else. And I want them to not be super expensive and like unaffordable for most people. Um, so this kind of turned into a little bit of a rant, but yeah, that's what I put together and um that's about it, I think. But this definitely got me just thinking a ton about language and autism specifically, which was really cool. And also just about how people talk about autism and autistic people in general. So yeah, this is cool and enlightening. And yeah, I don't know if there's a fancy good way to end this, but yeah, that this was cool. And I'm just gonna be digging more into these and watching more of these videos and falling further down this rabbit hole. Though I might lean more in the direction of like it'd be cool to look more at like the reg comp or the composition end of things and looking at like autistic writing. Um, so yeah, thank you for watching this whole thing if you did, and sorry it wasn't much to look at. I think I just scrolled up and down a couple times and then talked a bunch, but that's how it goes sometimes, I suppose. And yeah, hope you're having a nice day. And I'm gonna click stall while I look for the stop record button. And thank you again for listening. And yep.